really pleased to be able to welcome Emily Worthington to our seminar series. She's Senior Lecturer in Music Performance at the University of Huddersfield and Co-Director of the Research Centre and Performance Practices there. And she's a clarinetist, has wide-ranging research interests, both practice-based and archival, British and German musical culture, from the late 18th century to the mid-20th century, sound recording, broadcasting, performance practice, woodwind performance and repertoire. She also co-directs Boxwood and Brass, the historical harmony or wind ensemble, and they're working on a new recording project called Beethoven Transformed. And I suspect we may hear a little bit about that as we go along today. But today, Emily is talking to us about historically informed performance, embodied knowledge, and the practice of harmony music. So if you can give a virtual riotous round of applause to welcome Emily, and we hand over to her now.
Thank you so much, and thanks very much, Chris, for the invitation to speak here as well. So, HIP, embodied knowledge, and the practice of harmony music. In 2013, a group of colleagues and I established the ensemble Boxwood and Brass out of a desire to create a professional period instrument ensemble specialising in the harmony music and wind chamber music of the classical and early romantic period. Such ensembles have existed in mainland Europe since the 1980s, but no such formation has yet achieved a similar long-term career in the UK. Harmony music as a repertoire, an ensemble and a practice has its roots in small wind ensembles that provided Tafelmusik and Feldmusik in the mid-18th century. The term can cover ensembles of a wide variety of sizes and configurations that were popular throughout Europe between circa 1770 and 1830, based around pairs of woodwind instruments and horns. Those small 5- and 6-part harmonien, as they're called, were probably the most common formations, and at least until after 1800. The most discussed examples of harmony music in modern scholarship relate to the octet of oboes, clarinets, horns, and bassoons, sometimes with a double bass or contrabassoon, that was popularized by the Emperor Joseph II during the 1780s. Joseph's Kaiserlich und Königlich Harmonie, or KK Harmonie, was assembled in 1782 from the wind players of his Burgtheater. Many similar groups subsequently appeared in the courts of other Viennese nobles, such as Prince Alois von Liechtenstein, and further afield, particularly where Viennese influence was felt or Joseph's favour courted. Based on contemporary accounts, there is no doubt that the best harmonien, who were usually made up of leading virtuosi, attained a standard of performance that equalled any ensemble active during the period. The aim of Boxwood and Brass was to develop our and our audience's understanding of this repertoire through long-term engagement. Boxwood and Brass works as both a Viennese model harmony of 8 winds plus double bass, and in the smaller configurations of 2 clarinets, 2 horns, and 1 or 2 bassoons that were common throughout Europe during the same period. Though we regularly perform English and French repertoire, the music we have immersed ourselves in most is all linked to Vienna. Unlike string quartet playing, which has been constantly discussed and theorized since it came into being in the late 18th century, the practice of harmony music in the late 18th and early 19th centuries is largely undocumented. Thus, though traditional forms of documentary and musicological research form a background to Boxwood and Brass's work, most of our insights are achieved through the direct and embodied experience of rehearsing and performing harmony music on period instruments. It is this practice-based process that is the focus of my paper today. My aim in so doing is to challenge the notion, frequently if tacitly presented in much scholarship, that the historically informed performance, or HIP, the practice of HIP, or historically informed performance, exists downstream of HIP research as an area to test theoretical hypotheses and refine ideas born through the study of artifacts left by past composers and performers. Instead, I consider the nature of the inquiry that takes place when an ensemble like Boxwood and Brass rehearses and performs together, and the kind of insights that result from it. In order to do this, I'll draw on theories of embodied knowledge, as well as semi-structured interviews with my colleagues in the ensemble, and my personal reflections on the experience of playing in it, to illuminate some aspects of the tapestry of ideas that shapes our ensemble practice. This paper is drawn from a working version of a longer chapter on the same topic that will be included in a forthcoming book from Oxford University Press, edited by Claire Holden, Eric Clark, and Kayana Ponchioni-Bailey, entitled Practice in Context, Perspectives on Historically Informed Practices in Post-Classical Music. Though Boxwood and Brass is an HIP ensemble formed of musicians who specialise in the instruments and musical styles and practices of the late 18th and 19th centuries, I would suggest that the ensemble treats HIP as a tool or process, something that we are doing rather than a goal to be achieved. We are not asking what is the historically correct way to perform Harmoniemusik, but rather what happens to the harmony and to Harmoniemusik when we approach it through the lens of historical information, context, perspectives, practices, and instruments. Our performances are part of an ongoing exploration, an open-ended process of developing understanding of a repertoire and exploring the possibilities it offers in practice. Anthropologist Tim Ingold describes this kind of observational and experiential learning in terms of, quote, thinking through making, prizing and opening and following where it leads, unquote. Put simply by one of my colleagues, we're just interested in how this all works. I suspect that this description would chime with many HIP performers and ensembles working today, but such is the shadow cast by the authenticity debates of the 1980s and 1990s that it bears stating outright. In 1999, two prominent musicologists declared confidently that HIP was, quote, a modernist phenomenon and as an intellectual concept, perhaps exhausted, unquote. The arguments on which this assertion is founded need not be re-rehearsed here in their entirety. It suffices to say that they centered on the notion that HIP is primarily a reflection of modern tastes, is unable to offer an objective insight into how musical works were sounded in the past, and thus, as a method of historical research, is of little real value. Though the weaknesses in these arguments have since been extensively critiqued, most notably by John Butt, it would be fair to say that HIP musicians remain wary of overstating the historical veracity of their work, at least in public. Keyboard player Tom Begin, for instance, cites his formative experiences as a graduate student in the heyday of the authenticity debates as the root of an instinctive fear that his project to record Haydn piano sonatas in digitally reconstructed historical rooms would make him, quote, an easy target for such fierce authenticity critics as Richard Taruskin or Peter Keavy, unquote. Yet I would suggest that privately, most historically informed performers feel that the process of engaging with period instruments and historical performing practices in some way puts us in touch with the past. I don't think I'd be out of line in saying the musicians of Boxwood and Brass wouldn't bother grappling with period wind instruments or trying to understand past performing styles if we didn't believe we were gaining some sort of insight from it. For all that individual creative freedom is important, and it is important in HIP, this is not an anything goes approach, nor is it simply an exercise in dressing one's performance in a different suit of clothes, as Michel Dulac has described it. Historian Emily Robinson aptly summarises this disconnect between theory and practice when she writes that, quote, theory and research continue to talk at cross purposes, the one insisting that the past is unknowable, the other unable to ignore the vitality of its sources, unquote. Robinson is discussing the affective experience of the archival researcher and the allure of physical contact with historical documents, but her characterization applies equally to the situation of the HIP musician. In order to interrogate the epistemic status of HIP practice, I've turned to the concept of embodied knowledge. Embodiment has featured strongly in recent attempts to theorize the relationship between practice and research in the arts and humanities. But HIP, despite being one of the most long-standing areas of practice research, has yet to enter into this discourse. It is beyond the scope of this paper to survey the significant range of theoretical and methodological accounts of practice research and embodiment that might offer an understanding of HIP practice. What follows instead is a necessarily brief overview of some key concepts in embodied knowledge based on the work of three scholars from different disciplines: Ben Spatz from theatre, Tim Ingold from anthropology, and Murphy McCaleb from music performance studies. So first then, embodiment is the whole musician. The first point I want to make about the terms embodiment and embodied knowledge is that they do not necessarily refer only to physicality and muscle memory. Though some theorists continue to posit a separation between the mind that understands how things can be done and the body that's able to actually do them, more useful in this context are accounts of embodied knowledge that reject this distinction in favour of a unified mind-body. Thus, when Spatz argues that the performing arts as embodied practices both produce and are structured by embodied knowledge in the form of what they call technique, their definition of technique encompasses, quote, thought, mind, brain, rationality, speech, and language, unquote, rather than just the mere mechanical physical skill that we are often told true artistry must transcend. When applied to music, Spatz's holistic concept of technique as embodied knowledge goes beyond the physical skills that are built by practicing scales and exercises, which to musicians is the usual musical meaning of the term. It encompasses instead everything from oral perception to physical gesture to the imaginative, analytical, and communicative skills more commonly inscribed under musicianship and artistry. The idea of technique as a form of complete musicianship is, aptly for HIP, not dissimilar to the 18th century usage of the word virtuosity, which similarly encompassed both instrumental skill and musicianship or artistry. This holistic model of technique that removes the artificial divide between the practical and physical aspects of music making on the one hand, and the artistic and creative on the other, is useful in understanding how our practice of music and our understanding of music are interdependent. If historically informed performance is a skilled practice, then embodied knowledge or technique is the package of skills that it both nurtures and relies on. For Ingold, skill arises from the, quote, intimate coupling of perception and action, unquote, the expert's constant attention to the variabilities of the materials they are working with that allows them to react judiciously. McCaleb elaborates a similar idea. He describes the development of fluency on an instrument as relying on an increasingly intimate attunement to the nuances of its response, which allows us to produce the effects we desire with increasing reliability. For Spatz, the stability and repeatability of skill or technique is what makes it a form of knowledge. It is, quote, a range of relatively reliable pathways through any given situation, unquote. These pathways of technique are the embodied knowledge that structures the practice of individuals and communities. Thus, my practice as a historical clarinet player, Boxwood and Brass's practice of harmoniemusik, and the practice of our 19th century predecessors are or were all structured by embodied knowledge in the form of technique, a package of relatively reliable skills, physical, perceptual, and otherwise, that work together to define the range of possibilities available to us in our music making. The next aspect of embodied knowledge I will consider here is that it is never static or complete. Practice is a process. For instance, every musical performance and every moment of every performance is shaped by those that have gone before. At the heart of Ingold's definition of skill as the coupling of perception and action is the idea that skill is not simply about predictable repetition, It is about the ability to react when things move in a different direction than expected. All of this means that our embodied knowledge is only ever provisional. In Spatz's words, it is, quote, never more than an unfinished and incomplete engagement with the affordances of reality, unquote. Practice is not only structured by our existing technique, but it also produces new technique. Ingold suggests that we look at our knowledge of the world as a process that is perpetually under construction as a result of our ongoing engagement with our surroundings. As much as our music making is shaped by our technique is shaped by our music making. Or, to borrow Christopher Small's term that encompasses a wider range of musical experiences than just performing, it is shaped by our musicking. Both Spatz and Ingold consider how embodied knowledge can transcend the individual to be shared by people separated by time and space. For Spatz, quote, we are able to work together and to communicate with each other because of the degree to which the material world, including our own embodiment, does respond in relatively reliable ways to actions taken, unquote. Ingold suggests that such experiential knowledge is not, quote, passed on as a compendium of information, but is rather grown into through a process of what might best be called guided rediscovery, unquote. He likens this to following trails through a landscape, or wayfaring. What defines expertise is thus not, as he puts it, a greater accumulation of mental content, but, quote, a greater sensitivity to cues in the environment and a greater capacity to respond to these cues with judgment and precision. Knowledge is relating to the world around you, and the better you know, the greater the clarity and depth of your perception, unquote. This enhanced perception doesn't only arise from direct encounters in the present, but can be fostered by what he describes as, quote, the retracing of a path through the terrain of lived experience, unquote. He continues, making their way from place to place in the company of others more knowledgeable than themselves, and hearing their stories, novices learn to connect the events and experiences of their own lives with the lives of predecessors, recursively picking up the strands of these past lives in the process of spinning out their own, unquote. I find this notion a strikingly apt description of HIP practice, retracing a path through a terrain, in this case, repertoires and musical practices, that 18th or 19th century musicians also traversed. We do this as best we can using the traces left by past lives to guide our own journey, including instruments, scores, and accounts of musical activities. The objective of the exercise, however, cannot be to establish the truth or to import their knowledge as an already constituted self-contained entity into our own practice. The point of it is the process itself, the development of an enhanced perception, a greater sensitivity to our musical surroundings, and the ability to respond to them in a more nuanced way. To summarize then, embodied musical knowledge can be viewed as an ongoing process developed through engaging with repertoires, instruments, other musicians, and performing practices. Through doing so, we establish relatively reliable pathways of technique in the form of perceptual sensitivity to the materials of music making and the skill to manipulate those materials. These pathways of technique ultimately enable the range of possibilities open to us in our practice and are simultaneously redrawn by that practice. In HIP, musicians use the material traces of past musical environments, such as period instruments and performance spaces and descriptions of past musical practice, to guide the development of our own technique. That is, our ability to perceive historically specific nuances in the music and the skills to act on that perception. Harmoniemusik presents a particular challenge to this methodology in that there are relatively few material traces to draw on. Though a widespread practice, written primary sources on it are relatively limited compared to other genres, particularly as regards performance and pre-performance practices, while accounts of performances tend to be scant and brief. Practical exploration of the vast repertoire of surviving Harmoniemusik works, original and arranged, is thus the primary means to gaining an in-depth understanding of the practice. This repertoire is the terrain through which we are seeking a path. It seems clear that embodied knowledge is founded in doing. As the basis of ensemble practice, therefore, it grows not in an abstract way, but in relation to the music that an ensemble plays. A substantial proportion of Harmoniemusik from the 18th and early 19th century consists of arrangements, and Boxwood and Brass's repertoire has always focused on these. This has been a deliberate choice to try and foster a broader understanding of Harmoniemusik for ourselves and our audiences, and as a result, our embodied technique has developed in relation to this repertoire. However, this poses an immediate challenge. Even among writers who argue for the importance of Harmoniemusik, the performance of arrangements has often been framed as a lower skilled activity than that of original works. David Whitwell, for instance, asserts that, quote, being the outstanding musicians that members of the Emperor's KK Harmonie were, I cannot believe they were satisfied to play primarily opera arrangements, unquote. Roger Hellier even implies that when the music of an opera was removed from its original vocal and theatrical setting, and therefore stripped of its dramatic associations, the loss of the original context can in some cases, quote, debase the value, unquote, of the music. The general bias against arrangements is compounded by the fact that Harmoniemusik arrangements are usually assumed to have served as functional music, particularly Tafelmusik, a term so synonymous with the harmonie that in some primary sources it is used to refer to the ensemble itself. Though various writers acknowledge that the notion of Harmoniemusik as mere occasional music is an oversimplification, there is an enduring idea that this practice consisted of serving up popular melodies to inattentive listeners. To underline my point, here's a recent programme note. This is a very recent programme note from an online streamed performance of Beethoven's Wind Octet. I haven't cited the source, I'll leave it anonymous, but I think it's particularly amusing that the writer ties himself in knots. He first asserts that the harmony, of course, was the ideal ensemble. It was for outdoor performance with background chatter, but then can't quite explain why Beethoven therefore would have written a piece for it, because of course his image of Beethoven is as someone who would write background music. It's quite a knot to tie yourself in there. Even the distinguished historical clarinetist Eric Hoprick, who leads a long-established period instrument harmony himself, with which he has recorded numerous arranged works, likes the practice of Harmoniemusik to, quote, background music, just as today's radio and other electronic devices, unquote. If this is the case, there are certainly implications for the historically informed performance of this repertoire. But it behoves us to take a step back and question the extent to which this narrative is a product of a 20th century musicological culture defined by notions of canon, virtue, and the negation of the performer, rather than a transparent reading of the evidence. My interest in the narrative of Harmoniemusik as background music is not so much in how it was listened to in a period where silent, concentrated audiences were anyway not yet the norm. Rather, I seek to uncouple Harmoniemusik in general, and arrangements in particular, from the modern concept of functional performance as involving less investment on the part of musicians than other kinds of musical activity. To return to Ingold's idea of wayfaring, I might ask, if Harmoniemusik arrangements are a terrain to be traversed, did the original musicians stop to look at the view? Did they take their time to understand the ecosystem and the topography of the land? Or were they head down, intent on simply getting to the other side of the hill by the most direct route possible in order to deliver their goods and collect their paycheck? What light has Boxwood and Brass's practice shed on these questions? Harmoniemusik arrangements vary greatly in the scope of their musical ambition and their relationship to the source work, from relatively simple settings of the main arias from popular operas to extravagant and ambitious reworkings of complete vocal and instrumental works that make huge demands on the players and take significant liberties with the original musical material. Boxwood and Brass's experience spans a range of these, from 5- and 6-part opera selections to 9-part harmonie based on complete operas and instrumental works. In my experience, even straightforward opera arrangements from the 1780s onwards place certain demands on the ensemble over and above the earlier divertimenti type pieces that typified the mid-18th century Harmoniemusik repertoire. For instance, a high degree of familiarity with the source work, such as the original players would have often possessed, is invaluable in negotiating the structure of movements, in delivering recitative passages, and in clarifying what can otherwise be confusingly dense textures. However, it is notable that the technical and musical demands of Harmoniemusik arrangements increases after 1800. The large-scale arrangements of instrumental works that appeared in the early decades of the 19th century not only demand a highly attuned chamber music-like ensemble practice, but because of the complexity of their source material, are often more demanding to put together even than sophisticated original partitas by contemporary composers such as Joseph Trebensee and Franz Krommer. Two arrangements of Beethoven's music, which have featured heavily in the development of boxwood and brass, stand out here. One is Carl Czerny's 1805 arrangement of the septet opus 20 for six-part harmonie, unpublished and possibly never previously performed, in which Beethoven's student and assistant explores the limits of the individual instrumental techniques of the clarinet, horn, and bassoon. The other, an anonymous arrangement of the Seventh Symphony issued by Beethoven's publisher Steiner in 1816, probably represents the limit of what is possible within the medium of the Harmoniemusik ensemble, both in terms of physical stamina and ensemble complexity. These are the kinds of pieces that tend to leave their mark on your body. From an individual point of view, some of the upper wind players, myself included, felt that playing this repertoire has extended our technique and helped us discover new possibilities in our instruments. One colleague spoke of the value of these projects as an opportunity to question the instrument, their reed setup, and their internal physical control of the sound. For another, the repertoire needed a certain mindset and a fundamentally faster finger technique and control over a wider dynamic and tonal range than they felt was demanded by other contemporaneous ensemble repertoire. From my point of view, the Czerny arrangement of the septet opus 20 required a very specific extension of technique to cope with the nature of the instrumental writing. Czerny writes much of the original violin part into the first clarinet, which, while it does not exceed the established range of the instrument, does result in quiet and lyrical writing with a higher than normal tessitura. It's time for our first musical interlude. Working on this arrangement has certainly pushed me to expand my tonal and expressive range on the early 19th century clarinet in a region of the instrument more commonly used for bravura effects. One effect of this experience has been to recontextualize the clarinet writing in contemporaneous orchestral repertoire. For instance, the delicate altissimo Gs written by Beethoven in both the Eighth Symphony and Missa Solemnis, which previously presented themselves as a radical departure from early 19th century orchestral clarinet writing, now appear as relatively routine, creating a very different performance experience for me in those works. In this way, we could say that playing the Czerny arrangement has created a new pathway of embodied technique that now underpins my practice as an orchestral musician. Another challenge of performing arrangements can be negotiating the relationship between the often very familiar original music and its arranged form. Our approach in Boxwood and Brass has been rather to preserve the quirks of the arrangements we play and try to step away from our existing ideas of the original music. Bastian Blomhert describes arrangements as filtering the original work, quote, through the musical imagination of the arranger and moulding it into the expressive means of the new medium, unquote, resulting in the best examples in, quote, an optimal application of the possibilities of the original music to the highest standards in writing for the new medium, unquote. I would go further and suggest that arrangements can often facilitate a free exploration of the possibilities of both the musical material and the medium for the performer. In the Seventh Symphony, for instance, we used contextual information about the early performances of the work to help shape a new interpretation. The idea that it was composed at the climax of Napoleonic Wars and premiered at a benefit concert for injured soldiers helped me personally banish the Wagnerian epithet of the apotheosis of the dance in favor of a mental imagery of thundering horses' hooves and the heightened emotional temperature of wartime and political instability. This, in turn, opened up new ways of using the rich and robust sound world of the wind ensemble and the intensity brought by the condensed textures of the arrangement. Reconceiving the music in this way can involve reinscribing it on your body in a new form. On one hand, it can be a challenge to let go of the embodied memory of the original work. One colleague spoke to me of having to fight the urge to fall into an established interpretation of the Beethoven septet, and another described how they deliberately went against their instincts when relearning this piece in order to disrupt and question their instinctive approach. Similarly, when performing the Seventh Symphony in orchestra after recording it in the Harmonie, one member of the group found they needed to write a reminder in their orchestral part not to revert to Boxwood and Brass's characterization of particular passages, which had become somewhat ingrained in their embodied memory of the piece. This physical inscription isn't limited to purely interpretative choices, but rather stems from the holistic nature of embodied knowledge. I don't think I will ever be able to rid myself of the physical sensation of arriving at the climax of the final movement of Beethoven 7 in the wind arrangement. Muscle stamina is, for wind players, a finite resource, and the Seventh Symphony arrangement undoubtedly pushes this resource to its limit, particularly in the context of a full evening 2-hour concert program. Though it became easier over repeated performances, playing this arrangement is never entirely comfortable. The tension of facing this challenge each time, the concentration of having to pace myself through the performance, digging increasingly deep into physical reserves to maintain stable technique in the face of increasing muscle fatigue, and the ultimate relief and exhaustion at approaching the end of the piece are now woven into my emotional experience of playing the work, and therefore for me, its aesthetic identity. I'm going to play you the last movement of the arrangement in its entirety, as I think we're running fairly well to time, as an example of this. It's the point I'm trying to get across is that the very practical physical side of playing this as a wind player is not separable from the aesthetic and emotional and expressive conception of the piece. You can't pull these two things apart. It's not like muscle fatigue is an inconvenient thing that detracts from my artistic vision. The feeling of playing the piece, the embodied feeling, is literally in a way where that interpretation comes from. I won't say any more, I'll just play it, but hopefully you'll hear what I mean. hopefully that gives a slight window into what I mean. To further illustrate, I genuinely have a very difficult time now accepting that movement is in a major key, because to me the intensity of it and the kind of, particularly the way even that the sort of return to the home key is undermined by that kind of sinister oscillating semiquaver in the bass, which we brought out quite a lot in the arrangement, and the feeling that by the time we get to the last kind of minute or so of music, I'm literally just shrieking and screaming over the top. That's how it feels to play it. It just kind of, it's hard to think of that as being a kind of a wholly one color positive, kind of joyful movement. I don't hear it like that anymore, and I'm certain that that's partly to do with my experience of playing it. But I think it's also there in the music, actually, and especially when you understand the context that it comes from more. It certainly isn't kind of simply easy, happy major key. G major, by the way, in that instance, if anyone has perfect pitching, was really disturbed. The arrangement is transposed into G from A, and it's also at A430, so that might have confused your ears if you do. So, historical sources then. Do these deeply personal experiences of playing early 19th century arrangements offer any insight into the practice of the original musicians? In fact, we don't know whether the two arrangements discussed here were played at all during the early 19th century. Czerny's septet arrangement only survives in a manuscript score, and the symphony in a single set of printed parts. It's quite possible that both of them represented a step too far in terms of their demands on the players. However, even if they only represent the ambitions of Harmoniemusik arrangers, they are still evidence of how far the practice of Harmoniemusik had developed by the early 19th century, in the sense of the fact that the arrangers could imagine that this was possible. Moreover, the extant primary sources indicate that arrangements were central to this process of development. From at least the 1780s, it is clear that arrangements were performed in a wide variety of contexts beyond Tafelmusik. For instance, between March and May 1787, the Emperor's KK Harmony performed Wendt's arrangement of Martin Isoler's recent opera Una Cosa Rara at an academy at the Karl-Orffner Theater, and at least 3 after-dinner concerts at the Palais de Schwarzenberg and at the Tonkünstlersocietät. Apologies for my German pronunciation. The following year, Wendt's arrangement of Soler's next opera, L'Abore di Diana, was included at an academy organised by the court musicians at the Burgtheater. Harmonien did also, of course, perform Tafelmusik, but even this is a more nuanced practice than is implied by the received narrative of background music. An article entitled Apologie der Tafelmusik in the Allgemeine Musikalische Zeitung, citing of all people Immanuel Kant, is evidence that the appropriateness of using music to accompany dining and socializing was a subject of debate around 1800. Interestingly, descriptions of such events do not support the notion that the performance of arrangements as Tafelmusik always involved less investment on the part of the players or the part of the audience than original works. Consider the following report by Karl Ludwig Juncker about the court music of Joseph II's brother, Elector Maximilian Franz, in 1791, and all translations from this point on are my own. So Juncker is obviously praises the quality of the musicians, true masters of their art, but he also, and he describes the performance as Tafelmusik, but his attention is clearly caught by the ensemble and its sophisticated level of performance. He singles them out for performing larger pieces, specifically an arrangement of an opera overture, probably in contrast with the divertimento style pieces that were specifically written for winds. In Koch's Musikalisches Lexikon of 1802, there is a more explicit suggestion that, that arrangements could be used to provide the harmonie with music of higher quality than was offered by such original divertimenti. So he says, he defines Harmoniemusik. He says you can have specially composed pieces called partia, which consist of movements in various styles and time signatures and can take on any character but do not follow one another in any particular order. So there he seems to be describing your typical divertimento. Or, he says, one arranges operas and other pieces of music for these instruments, because until now there is still a lack of a sufficient number of good pieces that were originally set for this kind of music, for this kind of ensemble. So he's saying you arrange operas to give the ensemble some good music to play. In a similar vein, a report of a concert performance from Dresden in 1789 explicitly states that arrangements could be more effective and perhaps affective in performance than some original wind music. So since one was used to hearing only sonatas, suites and marches from these instruments, this masterpiece, that is the arrangement of Don Giovanni, made all the more impression. I would argue that Harmoniemusik at the turn of the 19th century became a site for musicians to explore what an ensemble of wind players was capable of, and that arrangements provided much of the material for that exploration. We also know that composers whose works were arranged often invested significant effort into the process. The oboist and composer Joseph Trebensee stated that poorly written arrangements would, quote, spoil the joy of the artists in producing them, unquote, implying, therefore, that well-constructed ones were rewarding to play. Beethoven's publisher Steiner promised that his Harmoniemusik arrangements were, quote, edited by renowned and famous masters from the original scores with special care and with an exact knowledge of the effects of wind instruments, unquote. It's known that Haydn and Beethoven worked closely with arrangers to arrive at satisfying reworkings of their music for different forces, including piano, strings, and wind ensembles. The musicologist Wiebke Thormalen argues that the educational appeal of string quartet arrangements of large-scale works such as Haydn Creation lay not only in allowing the deconstruction of the music in a domestic setting, but in the belief that direct physical engagement through playing, as opposed to passive observation, developed the, in this case, amateur players' rational and affective understanding of the music, as well as their inner taste and sensibility. Arrangements, then, provided a form of embodied learning. A link between this educational use of arrangements and the Harmoniemusik tradition can be found in the short-lived Conservatorium der Blasinstrumenter, established by the Berlin-based clarinetist Franz Tausch in 1804. The Conservatorium was a musical Gesellschaft modelled after the Berlin Singakademie, which brought together professional musicians and noble amateurs. Tausch described it thus: I believe that the highest possible perfectionment of all wind instruments can only be achieved through the bringing together of all kindred forces. And this gave me the idea to form an independent institution where many artists could strive together to this purpose, which would best be achieved not only individually, but also, as I hoped and was later truly convinced, through a large instrumentation, which could create a hitherto wholly unknown effect. Though Tausch never uses the term Harmoniemusik, what he created was essentially a large wind ensemble that played arrangements of operas and instrumental music. That an organisation was formed with the explicit aim of developing wind playing by performing arrangements is clear evidence that this potential was recognised in the early 19th century. It would perhaps be a relatively straightforward task to offer a revisionist argument from primary sources alone that Harmoniemusik around the turn of the 19th century was a skilled practice and that harmony arrangements were viewed as more than musical wallpaper. Indeed, that would have been a far easier paper to write than this attempt to combine theory, practice, and historical evidence. However, to have done so would obscure the fact that my conviction that Harmoniemusik arrangements were used in some cases as a vehicle for highly accomplished players to develop their practice and realise their artistic potential stems fundamentally from my own experiences of playing the repertoire. Rather than using my practice to confirm a conjecture drawn from the written evidence, I've attempted to reflect here the way that my reading of the written sources stems from my practice-based insights. In order to counter the suggestion that this makes my argument overly subjective, that I am reading my own fanciful ideas into the sources, I've drawn on recent theorizations of embodied knowledge to explicate how embodied musical technique is developed in relation to bodies of repertoire. To those who remain unconvinced, I would respectfully suggest that to insist that embodied research is more subjective than documentary research rather overestimates the objectivity of the latter. My argument is that musical technique, as a holistic and fluid body of knowledge in the most literal sense, both underpins and is developed by musical practice, and thus the embodied knowledge generated by doing historically informed performances of particular repertoires is evidence that should be pressed into service in the wider discussion about those repertoires. It is the interdependence of embodied knowledge and the embodied experience that explains both why HIP can never completely replicate the practice of past performers, and conversely, why it inevitably offers insights into that practice that could not be gleaned simply from written sources. Christopher Small wrote that, quote, practice does not exist in order to present musical works. Sorry, performance does not exist in order to present musical works, but rather musical works exist in order to give performers something to perform, unquote. The real research value of HIP lies not in asking how should this music be played, but what kind of musical activity was this music created to facilitate? And what does my engagement with it do to me as a musician and to my understanding of this musical landscape? Historical repertoires such as Harmoniemusik were a terrain through which the wind players of the late 18th century journeyed, developing their technique and their practice along the way and leaving their mark on the landscape as they went. In some cases, even building the hills that they had to climb. Re-exploring this terrain today, guided by artifacts of that journey, such as period instruments and documentary sources, does not mean that we are reliving their exact experience, but it does help us see the landscape from a similar perspective, to pick our route through similar obstacles, and ultimately to come away ourselves similarly remade. Thank you very much.